Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Sudan's opposition claims that 20 people have been killed since Saturday in a crackdown on an anti-government sit-in in Khartoum. Crowds are hunkering down for a fourth night outside the complex. Also, the UN warned that escalating violence in Libya will mean that a peace summit planned for mid-April will have to be called off. Meanwhile, Khalifa Haftar's fighters continue to advance on Tripoli. And for it's more than a year now, Chadians have not been able to access social media. Critics say it's an unacceptable censorship, but the government says it's a move necessary for its struggle against terrorism. But first, in Sudan, protesters hunkered down for a fourth night, camped out outside of the complex in Khartoum that houses President Omar al-Bashir's residence and the country's security headquarters. Huge crowds have been rallying for the sit-in in the hope of getting the army to back their calls for an end to Bashir's 30-year rule and the creation of a transitional government. Security forces kept trying to break up the sit-in, and activists claim that 14 people were killed on Tuesday. Amnesty International reckons at least 9 have been killed since Saturday. The US, the UK and Norway have now echoed protesters' calls for political transition. Owen Barnell has more.
A cause for celebration. Protesters carry soldiers aloft in Khartoum as for the second day running, the Sudanese military appear to have protected demonstrators from police and security forces in the capital. Since Saturday, demonstrations have been ongoing outside Khartoum's presidential compound that also houses the Defence Ministry and the Army's headquarters, and events are moving fast. Camped out on President Omar al-Bashir's doorstep, protesters have been calling for the president to go and for the army to take their side. On Monday, it seemed to finally happen. Amateur footage appeared to show the army deploying outside the compound to protect protesters after they were attacked by security forces. Then on Tuesday morning, there were reports the military allowed protesters inside the compound after they were charged once more by security forces firing tear gas. Government officials have denied any rift between military and police, though on Tuesday, state media announced that police have been instructed not to confront citizens in peaceful gatherings. What began as protests back in December over the government's decision to triple the price of bread rapidly escalated into a nationwide movement opposing al-Bashir, in power since 1989.
Well, despite the protests being the biggest threat to Bashir's rule in 3 decades, since December, the army stayed on the sidelines whilst security agents and riot police carried out deadly crackdowns. Rob Parsons tells us more about how divisions in the army, police and security service could affect Sudan's political future.
There's a difference between the ordinary police and the NISS, the National Intelligence and Security Service, which is much more hardline, much closer to Bashir, and also the Rapid Support Forces, which are drawn in turn from the Janjaweed, who are the most brutal element, paramilitary group in the Darfur killings back at the beginning of the century. The ones most responsible for the worst atrocities, who are now also behind Bashir and apparently taking part in these attacks on the demonstrators. There's a difference between them and the ordinary police. The ordinary police have now said, we're not going to get involved in this, we're standing aside, as have large elements of the military, including, it has to be said now, the Army Chief of Staff, who's saying that the soldiers who are protecting the demonstrators are only discharging their duty. That's a really interesting development. Very concerning, I think, for Bashir.
Rob Parsons there with us a little earlier on. Now, in Nigeria, Boko Haram insurgents have attacked the northeastern city of Damaturu for the first time in over 4 years. The IS-linked jihadists raided the capital of Yobe State on Tuesday afternoon. Witnesses say that they were heavily armed. By the evening, troops were reportedly exchanging gunfire with the suspected extremists in and around the city. Meanwhile, the attack came after soldiers forced 2,000 people to evacuate from nearby Jakana village to Maiduguri in neighbouring Borno State because of a planned military offensive against local insurgents. Thousands of people took to the streets once again on Tuesday to reject Algeria's new interim president. Earlier in the day, Abdelkader Ben Salah was named by parliament to replace Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who resigned last week after weeks of protests against efforts to extend the 19 years he'd spent in power. Ben Salah is a long-time Bouteflika ally, and critics say that little will change under him. He's pledged, though, to respect the constitutional requirement for elections to be organised within 90 days. And the World Bank's cut this year's growth forecast for sub-Saharan Africa from 3.3% to 2.8%. The slowdown's been partially explained by a decline in industrial production and the effects of a trade dispute between the US and China. The downward turn is also a reflection of slower growth in Nigeria, South Africa and Angola, which together make up about 60% of sub-Saharan Africa's annual economic output. Now, the UN said that it will be impossible to hold a planned peace conference for Libya because of deepening conflict in the country that has left at least 51 dead. The summit had been set for mid-April to pave the way for elections and the unification of the country's fractured governance, but fighting is escalating as a military commander, Khalifa Haftar, continues to march his fighters towards Tripoli in a bid to wrest it from his rivals.
It might just be a big hole in the ground at Tripoli airport, but it's another important sign that the bitter fallout from Libya's Arab Spring continues. Finding peace and forging a stable democracy has proved problematic since the toppling by rebel fighters of the former dictator Muammar Gaddafi in October 2011. The death of the man who'd controlled the oil-rich country for 42 years sparked jubilant celebrations, but it also created a thorny power vacuum. Following the fall of the regime, the National Transitional Council called for elections to be held 8 months later. That vote resulted in fragile power being handed to the 200-seat General National Congress, which was given an 18-month mandate to find a democratic constitution. Tensions simmered and sporadic violence ensued, but the splintering of the nation was truly cemented in 2014. In May that year, the Libyan National Army, led by the former Gaddafi general Khalifa Haftar, began pummeling Islamist militant groups in Benghazi and also attempted to seize parliament. Elections that year then redrew the political map as the House of Representatives took power in Tobruk, backed by General Haftar, and a hodgepodge of leaders put together a rival administration in Tripoli. The months of unrest took their toll on the civilian population, a situation which worsened when the Islamic State group jumped on the chaos to make territorial advances. A glimmer of hope appeared in 2016 when lengthy talks resulted in rival political groups forming the Unity Government of National Accord, led by the UN-backed Fayez Sarraj. But in September last year, that same government rang the alarm bell loud as skirmishes broke out in Tripoli's southern districts between rival militia groups. And now, as those killed in Haftar and his Libyan National Army's latest attempt to seize the city are buried, the United Nations appeals to the many warring parties in Libya to avoid any further senseless violence and bloodshed.
For more than a year now, Chadians have not been able to access social media networks. Critics say it's unacceptable censorship. The government insists the move is a necessary part of a struggle against terrorism. Nicolas Chemin has more.
Andreas owns a startup in Jamena that sells products online. His company is suffering from the ban on social media in Chad.
Most people here in Chad who use the internet do so via social media. So the censorship against social media has a direct impact on our online sales. That means we lose money and cannot cover our costs. So it's a huge cost for our business.
Officially, access to Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, etc. is blocked because of the government's fight against terrorism. But human rights activists point out that the ban appeared a year ago, when demonstrators protested against a change to the constitution that would reinforce the president's powers. The amendment passed and benefited Idriss Déby, who's already been ruling Chad for nearly 30 years. Many Chadians want an end to this ban on social media.
It's not helping Chadians, it's cutting us off from the rest of the world.
It's very difficult for us students. For 1 year now I can't use the internet because of the censorship. It's very difficult, and all this in the context of an economic crisis. It's very hard.
To bypass the ban, some Chadians use virtual private networks or VPNs, but they are costly. Others cross the border and buy Cameroonian SIM cards. Recently, the African Union's Human Rights Commission called on Chadian authorities to remove the ban.
And the FIFA Women's World Cup trophy paraded through Yaoundé on Tuesday. Cameroon's the 17th country to welcome the trophy, which headed over from Durban in South Africa. It's due next in Abuja, Nigeria, the third city on the continent to receive the coveted cup. The World Cup's top 24 women's teams will battle it out for the cup here in France between June 7th and July. So that is one to watch here on France 24. That is, though, where we're going to have to leave it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.